I suspect that I'm not alone among our listeners when I say that during the 1980s, I was a huge fan of Garrison Keillor's radio show, A Prairie Home Companion. It featured a segment each week called The News from Lake Wobegon, a fictional Minnesota town he always described as being where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. The tongue-in-cheek description of this fictional town actually spawned a psychological label called the Lake Wobegon effect to describe how often people overestimate their intelligence, their looks, or their importance. Obviously, no one wants to be below average, right? You might prefer to say that you're not good at spelling or math or foreign languages, but you would never want to explain a subpar school performance by just saying, well, I am below average. However, just going by the definition of the word, half of the people in the world are below average. If there are 100 students in a class, at least 49 of them are below average. That's what the word means. Still, as a teacher, every time I had a student try to tell me, well, Dr. Ray, I'm just not smart enough to understand this assignment, I would do verbal gymnastics assuring that student that they were just as smart as anyone else in the class, all the while doing battle with that voice in my head that was saying, some people just aren't college material. Still, the people who are willing to just honestly say, I'm just not that smart, are in the smallest of groups of people. Most people who really are just not that smart will more often think that they are uniquely gifted and significantly more intelligent than almost everyone else. They are the ones who talk the most about having common sense. When they say it, they mean that highly educated experts are somehow deceived, misled by their education, and that what they know, just inherently, what they know is superior to what other people have learned in school. The term for this is now called the Dunning-Kruger effect. People of low competence often believe themselves to be much more competent than they are because they don't know enough to be aware of just how incompetent that they are. In fact, the most incompetent people often have more confidence, as this graph shows. The less you know, the more confident you are, and when you actually have expert training, you become aware of how little you know and how much you don't know, and your self-confidence tends to go down. This really doesn't have anything to do with a person's innate intelligence, whether you're college material or not. I have a degree in philosophy. I have a master's and a doctorate in pastoral counseling. I did a postdoc at Harvard focused on ethics and public policy. However, when the transmission went out in my car recently, I didn't even know how to check the transmission fluid. I thought I did, but I didn't. I'm a total novice when it comes to how my own car works. And so I turned it over to a guy at a transmission shop, not to say that he's more above average than I am, but to just acknowledge that rebuilding a transmission is not something I know how to do, and I'm not going to pretend like I have the slightest interest in learning how to do it. However, when it comes to something like, the COVID-19 virus, we saw the Dunning-Kruger effect everywhere we turned. By April of 2020, everyone you met in the grocery store aisle was a virologist. Hardly any of them would even begin to rebuild their own transmission, which would be much easier to do than to earn a PhD in virology. But with just a few news reports and maybe looking at a couple of social media posts, a lot of people thought that they knew more than Anthony Fauci. As I was waiting to board an international flight during the height of the pandemic, I got to overhear a heated argument between an airline employee and one of those self-appointed virologists. The irritated man was refusing to wear a mask on board because he insisted they make no difference. He explained a virus is so small that it can pass through the fabric of a mask like a gnat flying through a chicken wire fence. I'm sure that most of you heard such things many times in the first couple of years of the pandemic. When everyone had calmed down that day, though, when that irate gentleman was finally wearing a mask so that he could get on the plane, I came up to him and tried to engage him in polite conversation, explaining that even though the virus is so small that it could easily pass through any kind of mask, the good news is that viruses don't have legs or wings. They don't move themselves. A respiratory virus travels in droplets of water that we exhale, and those droplets might be carrying thousands of viruses, but thankfully the mask would stop most of those vapor droplets. It's obvious, isn't it? Viruses don't have legs, they don't have wings, so they have to be spread through some other vehicle, right? Now here's the part that's harder to take. After hearing my amateur virus lesson, he looked at me and said, "Masks don't help." And that gets us to the larger problem of the Dunning-Kruger effect. He could acknowledge that viruses don't have legs or wings. What he could not acknowledge was that he might be wrong. That gets at the larger problem we have in our society today. People will believe that what they know, maybe it's not even true, but they prefer to believe it anyway, in spite of the facts. Now, if this low information virologist and I found ourselves aloft in that airplane later, and God forbid, both the pilot and co-pilot became deathly ill with a coronavirus that flew right through their masks, would he prefer that I, a licensed private pilot, take over the controls, or would he insist that he be allowed to fly the plane, assuming that he knew as much about piloting an aircraft as he knew about the coronavirus? Now, as a private pilot, I've had a few weeks of training. I owned a single-engine Cessna, and when my friend recently gave me this T-shirt that identifies me as being the world's okayest pilot, I said to him that I had in fact walked away from every single one of my landings, as did any passengers I ever had in the plane with me. And I have even successfully landed a commercial jet in a simulator at UPS because I have the basic knowledge of the control surfaces of an airplane. Now, I think he would give me the pilot seat in a nanosecond. He might start praying like a Catholic nun until we were on the ground, but he would know that even just my meager 80 hours of pilot training and few years of episodic flying small planes was still a lot more than he had. Most of the time, when our own lives are at stake in a very clear way, we can get congruent with the truth. But in the absence of immediate consequences, we can still elevate what we want to be true to the point of being absolutely true. I feel that this is one of those times when we absolutely must quote the great Dane, Søren Kierkegaard, who said, "There are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true, and the other is to refuse to believe what is true." In a recent CBS poll, Trump voters responded in a large majority that they believe that Trump tells the truth more reliably than their own family members and even the minister or priest of their church. Now that's hard to imagine since Trump is broadly known to lie constantly, objectively more than any other president or any other politician, literally more than 3,000 times that have been counted while he was in office. After his recent booking in Georgia, along with his mugshot, Trump reported that they recorded him as being 6'3" and 215 pounds. A friend of mine, one of our local church members, actually is 6'3" and 215 pounds, and he posted this picture of himself next to the picture of Trump in his golf outfit for comparison. Trump might weigh 215 pounds on the moon, but in Georgia, he would be a lot closer to 300. But this is obvious, isn't it? Just like it's obvious that Trump did not get his big, beautiful wall built along our southern border. In fact, he only got about 400 miles of the wall built, half of which was replacing already existing barriers, and in spite of his often repeated claim that Mexico would pay for the wall, they didn't pay for any of it. Now, that's a fact. That's not a conservative perspective or a liberal perspective. That's a fact. But even in venial matters, like his criticism of how much Barack Obama played golf, Trump vowed that he would not play golf while president because he would be working all of the time. But as most of us know, he actually played golf twice as much as Obama did. So in matters small and large, whether it was stealing classified documents, sexually assaulting women, paying off a porn star, using his office to get business with wealthy foreign governments, at least one of which is a sponsor of international terror, it should be obvious that our former president is one of the most corrupt and dishonest men in history. The question looms larger with every passing week. Why then do people still support him and say that they think he was a great president and that they do not believe that he lies or that he ever did anything wrong? As of this moment, even with several pending trials for crimes that might see Trump in prison before he ever gets back into the White House, polls indicate that Biden and Trump are virtually tied in their prospects of winning the 2024 election. There is increasing talk in the media about Trump's base of voters having become a cult. Now that's strong language, and I have resisted using it. I went to seminary in 1980 when taking a course on cults was a part of the curriculum. That was less than 2 years after the famous Jonestown mass suicide. Younger people may not know much about what happened that day, but there were actually audio recordings made of the mass suicide when more than 900 people died from drinking poisoned Kool-Aid, a third of whom were children. In class, we had to listen to that recording. And even though it was more than 40 years ago, I still get nauseous when I think about it. Jim Jones turned a Christian Church Disciples of Christ congregation into a cult. He fed them on paranoid lies about threats of nuclear war, of government intervention in their lives, all while he was cleaning out their bank accounts and having countless affairs with both women and men in the congregation. Now that is a cult. And just like I hesitate to compare anyone to Hitler unless they are pushing a program of mass genocide, I think we need to be very careful about using that term in a flippant way. Everyone isn't a Hitler or a Nazi. However, it must be said that Hitler didn't start with a Holocaust, and Jim Jones didn't start with mass suicide. When I took my cult class at Vanderbilt under the famous cult researcher Herman Norton, he identified the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormon Church as being cults, but he didn't mention the Catholic Church or the Assemblies of God. Jonestown, Waco, Heaven's Gate, as well as some of the cults that were in the news for years, like the Moonies, are easier to spot because they were crazy and dangerous in new ways. But if a cult is an organization that says that they or their leader is virtually infallible and that you must suspend critical thinking and believe what your cult teaches you in spite of the obvious fact that a lot of what it teaches is simply not true, well then, the Trump base may very well be a cult. In much the same way that certain religious groups no matter how old or how big they are, have cult-like tendencies. But if a cult is known by its insistence that people believe what is obviously not true without question, and that they allow themselves to be controlled even to the point of being sexually and financially exploited, then it gets easy to see that Trump voters are, in that way, a cult. But then you might also have to say that about the Catholic Church. And many people who have left the Mormon Church describe themselves as having been the victim of a cult. Leaving a Church of Christ or an Assemblies of God church can require counseling, which is basically a kind of deprogramming therapy that is about having left a cult. Now, I don't want to be anti-Catholic. I did my doctoral work in monastic spirituality. I am deeply read into classic Catholic spiritual material, and some of my closest friends have been the Trappist monks who live in the various monasteries where I did my research. But the mere fact that there is a healthy way to be a Catholic or a healthy way to be a Mormon does not erase the fact that there is a large portion of both churches, maybe the majority of both, that are taught to overlook sexual abuse and financial exploitation. I own and cherish my collection of books by Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist monk and activist. But that does not mean that our local bishop is not a dangerously dishonest man. Just as there are people who may actually have a rational argument to make in favor of Donald Trump as a presidential candidate, but the people who have actual fact-based motivations are in such a minority that it is not unfair to say, in a more general way, that there is something seriously wrong with most of the people who are unquestionably supporters of Trump. They are not oriented to reality. They have given up on critical thinking. They are unwilling to be either self-critical or to be honestly critical of their orange Caligula. I bring this up today because I'm afraid that we may be no more than 14 months away from permanently losing our democracy, with all of the hard-fought-for civil rights and personal freedoms that once made America a beacon of hope to the world. We are living through a period of history in which fascism is on the rise in many countries, as people are stoked with fear of immigrants, of transsexuals, and even fear of books, just as people in religious cults are manipulated by fear of hell and an angry skyfather. I've always felt that it was my job to be critical of my government in order to advocate for more justice, for equality, for freedom. But now I realize for the first time in my life that our imperfect government may be the only thing that protects us from the violence and insanity of global fascism. And you can certainly tell that I'm still plenty angry about the degree to which my own religious tradition asked me to avoid critical thinking and to believe what was clearly not true, though I will say that in most cases, the people who were trying to indoctrinate me had been lied to and indoctrinated themselves. But still, isn't it time that we reject any politician, any religious leader, or even any corporation that demands uncritical loyalty? Scott Peck famously said that anything that cannot be questioned is an idol, and all idols are slated for destruction. This has been a primary difference between religion and science. Religion generally encourages you to believe a creedal statement as being factual and being beyond question. Science, when it works as intended, encourages you to question everything and to be willing to change your beliefs based on new evidence. I believe religion and politics should operate more like science. People of faith should be willing to question their beliefs and to emphasize only those beliefs for which there is substantial evidence. Our faith should be closer to physics than it is to fiction, and so should our political dialogue. You should be especially suspicious of any religion or politician who tries to manipulate you based on either fear or greed. I'd like to close with one more reference to the Great Dane. I always loved Kierkegaard because he was a man of passionate faith, but he was equally passionate in his criticisms of the church and of religion in general. His insights sometimes burned like a hot poker, but it's difficult to find many instances in which what he said wasn't true. He said of his peers, "People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for freedom of thought, which they seldom use." Thinking is good, folks. Just believing lies is bad. The only reason to be seduced into a cult is to be relieved of the obligation to think for yourself. And that, while possibly tempting, is always a bad idea.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.